How you doing, folks? Welcome along to the Divine Message with me, Andrew Divine. If you like this episode, hit the like button. If you want to hear more content from me, hit subscribe. And if you want to share it with other people, that'll be most welcome to do. And you can find me on Substack. You might be watching this on Substack, and I'm also on YouTube as the Divine Message. I'm going to talk about something today that rarely gets mentioned in the debates about mass immigration into the UK or the Republic of Ireland. They're the two countries where I've lived my adult life, and where all my ancestry is from either island. And I've all my family, all my close friends are on either island. I consider myself Irish and British. Something that gets me in a little bit of trouble, but that's where my heritage comes from. It comes from both islands, and culturally I belong to both places. Anyway, it's probably a video for another day. But today I want to discuss something that I think is going to appeal to say people who would consider themselves centrist boomers, centrist Gen Xers. And by centrist I mean people centre left, centre right. I myself am probably more centre right. I still have some slightly centre left views on a few things, but I would largely be small c conservative on many things, although I was once a very radical leftist going back quite a few years. But anyway, I think that this video will appeal to the centrist type people who are confused about why, when they try to talk to their more left-wing woke friends, more radical left, progressive type people, when they try and talk about the topic of immigration, why, if they don't subscribe 100% to this open borders worldview, they get condemned as racist or far right, even though, us centrist type people we're not anti-immigration, we're anti-mass immigration, and there's a world of difference, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I want to explain today, though, the cultural and psychological motivations why so many progressive boomers, or Gen X is my generation, why they support de facto open immigration policies, and why they can't handle the slightest disagreement with those very extreme immigration policies. You see, progressive boomers and Gen Xers, they view any criticisms of mass immigration through a particular cultural and psychological lens. And once you understand the cultural and psychological motivations for their views on immigration, it'll all make sense why they view even people with centrist views on immigration as the same as Nazis. Okay, I'm just going to go back in time a little bit. So, as we all know, after the Second World War, there was an influx of migration from former British colonies or from parts of the West Indies that still were ruled by Britain up until the 1960s. And we have to be honest, like back in those decades, the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, there was a lot of genuine nasty racism directed at these migrants that came in at that time. A lot of it was solely because they were black or brown skinned. And now, because many people then, they just opposed all immigration, especially of non-whites. And it wasn't everybody, but, it was a significant cohort. And, unlike those of us today who are critical of mass immigration, but we're fine with manageable, levels of immigration, many people then, they didn't make the distinction between manageable numbers of more culturally compatible migrant groups and groups that were culturally incompatible. They just didn't like seeing brown and black faces, and we have to be honest about that. Many of our ethnic minority citizens were well integrated, who were born here. They tell us that, they grew up with it, and I believe them. Now, I just want to steel man my argument here, because I can already feel the more ethnic nationalist people wanting to bring up certain topics and issues and get into that. I'm not an ethnic nationalist, I'm a civic nationalist. But I'm going to throw the ethnic nationalists, I'm going to just, how would I put it? I'm going to just analyze where they're coming from slightly, okay? Now, while I support manageable levels of culturally compatible immigration, regardless of skin colour, I do think it's possible for people to want zero or near zero immigration that doesn't have anything to do with hating other races. There are some ethnic nationalists that don't hate other races. They just want to live in an ethnically homogenous society. I don't share that view, but I don't necessarily think that makes somebody a racist, because a racist is someone who hates other people. And let me just elaborate here a bit. So there's many countries and cultures outside the West that actually strictly limit immigration, or don't have any immigration at all. And most of them are not doing that because they hate other people and because they're racist. Take the Japanese. For Japanese is an ethnicity, and citizenship to them is not just a piece of paper. You know, for example, the Japanese do have immigration, but it's highly regulated. The numbers are limited. And while some immigrants stay there all their lives on extended work visas, they can never become Japanese citizens. Now, while I don't want immigration to be as limited as Japan, or I don't completely share their approach to citizenship, I kind of support it to a slight degree, elements of it, but I think if someone is an ethnic minority citizen and they've lived here a long time, they're fully integrated, they should be able to, you know, be one of us. And that's where I'm not an ethnic nationalist. However, I believe it's in the rights of the Japanese to set out their criteria for citizenship to be based on ethnicity. And I think that it's possible for them to do that without it being about hating other races. It's their motivation is to keep Japan Japanese, and you know, Japanese's culture will be maintained by people who are ethnically Japanese. And that doesn't mean they hate other people, does it? As I said, I don't share 100% their view on immigration. When I'm saying they have a point and they're not racist for having that. And the reason I bring that up is because I want to contrast Japan with us here in Western countries, and in particular the English speaking world, but it's basically all Western countries now, and especially Western Europe and Canada, New Zealand. America's got a reprieve from some of this madness under Trump. Because you see, it's only Western countries who were already welcoming to a degree of non-European origin immigration. We were already quite welcoming. Yes, there was racism and there was mistreatment of some of those people, but overall we were welcoming. Then what happened was, in the 1990s, our elites and our progressive media, they started promoting the idea that we had to be open to mass immigration of unlimited amount of people from everywhere. It wasn't enough that we were welcoming and we took in some people and that they integrated with us and many of them became great people and we value them as our own. But now we had to have unlimited amounts from everywhere. No other part of the world does that except the West. And like, not only have our country's been extremely welcoming to those migrants, and most of us accept them, the ones who have integrated fully and are citizens of our countries, but our elites now tell us that we're racist if we now call for any reasonable limits on how welcoming we should be. I mean, we even have ethnic minority citizens who are born here who say the same thing. You know, it's not just white gammon type people like me. There's lots of people making these arguments from that aren't white. Because we, at the end of the day, you see, we simply don't have all the resources available for the amount of people who want to come here. We're not allowed to talk about that, okay, without being smeared or condemned. And it's even worse than that, than the resource constraints is one issue. The numbers are so high, we just have had an enormous effect on housing, cost of rent, cost of housing to buy. We can't talk about any of that, we get smeared, but it's even worse than the resource constraints. If you look at the fact that our elites and our media are facilitating and support the importation of Islamic supremacists, people who despise us. It's not all Muslims, but it's enough of them that have that Islamic supremacist mindset. We're also importing large numbers of sex offenders. We see these court cases all the time of non-European males overrepresented, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali has dug down into the data about that. They're overrepresented in sex offending statistics, especially things like gang rape. And we're importing all of that. And if we object, we're told we're the problem. If we even peacefully protest, we run the risk of a police baton, as happened in Dublin last year after protests at a large migrant centre. After a child was raped by a so-called asylum seeker. It was either near or on the premises of one of the biggest asylum centres in Ireland. You don't have to demonise all asylum seekers. You can acknowledge there's a problem without demonising all of them. But we live in such an absurd reality now, that the Irish government, they actually hired a Nigerian leftist academic, Eben Joseph, I think is her name. She's the special rapporteur on racism or something like that is the title. Very well paid to lecture the Irish government on how racist the Irish people are. Meanwhile, over in Nigeria last year, you couldn't make up, they actually passed a law banning whites or even black foreigners from being on TV ads, other Africans, okay? It's just absurd. The West are the only people that are just self-flagellating themselves over the issue of abandoning their borders and seeing themselves as racist even whilst they abandon their borders. So left liberal progressives and boomers who grew up or were young adults between the 60s and 90s, right? They were conditioned to believe that any criticisms of immigration policies is synonymous with racial hatred because of the actual racism of some of the people who opposed immigration at that time. And it's through that cultural lens which they now erroneously view the issue of 21st century mass immigration. There are also psychological and moral components to the worldview of open borders boomers and Gen X progressives, in that they view themselves as good people with correct morals, and opposing racism is the moral thing to do. I agree with them on that. I just disagree with how they define that. And as I've just pointed out, they've been conditioned to view any criticisms of immigration as synonymous with racism, right? They've been conditioned to view criticisms of immigration as being synonymous with racism. And that's why it's almost impossible to have a nuanced discussion with them about the issue of immigration and get them to address the reality of resource constraints caused by excessively high numbers, or even to get them to acknowledge that certain immigrant groups, like say Indian Sikhs, Middle Eastern Christians, African Christians, that those people are a better cultural fit in manageable numbers with British and European people than, say, an Afghan Taliban supporter is, or an Islamic supremacist Somali and FGM enthusiast. Basically, the people coming in on the small boats across the English Channel. Most of them are coming from countries rife with Islamic supremacism, violent misogyny, anti-Western sentiment. And you can't talk to the Gen X progressive or boomer progressive about this. Because the moment a boomer or Gen X leftist open border progressives is faced with anyone critical of 21st century mass immigration policies, which are radically more open than the immigration policies of the 50s, 60s, 70s, all those people see and hear in their mind's eye when you're being critical of mass immigration, all they're seeing in their mind's eye is some frothing at the mouth, National Front, Nazi, skinhead, lunatic from the 70s or 80s who just hates people because they have a different skin colour and wants zero foreigners living in his country. That's what they see because they're conditioned. And unless you can break through that cultural and psychological conditioning with regards to the issue of mass immigration, it's impossible to have a constructive debate with progressive Gen Xers or boomers on the issue. Because while you're trying to have a nuanced discussion about mass immigration, the boomer and Gen X or progressive is actually having a Pavlovian response. That's what's going on. And like I used to be of that mindset myself in my 20s. You know, uh, luckily for me, I've always been open to at least hearing what the other side, or many of the other sides, because not just one view on this issue, have to say. And once I was presented with the evidence that late 20th century and early 21st century mass immigration has brought many negative consequences, then I altered my views on immigration. And now, even though I still support it, I don't get any credit from my boomer Gen X progressive friends, because now I qualify my support for immigration by emphasizing the numbers need to be manageable and sustainable and can't put the people who are already here at a disadvantage, okay? And that we need to ensure that the people coming in are culturally compatible with us, regardless of their skin colour. There's many great black, like I've said it, and brown people that have come to our countries and fully integrated with us. But it doesn't matter. You can acknowledge all that. The Gen X progressive boomer, he doesn't care. He just hears that you're being critical of immigration. He's been conditioned to see any criticism as racism, and you're stuck in that loop with them. Now, in order to understand further the psychology of Gen X and boomer progressives, it's important to understand that like we're actually the generations who grew up listening to music that transcended cultural and racial lines. We grew up listening to Motown, Philly soul, disco soul, funk from Black America. Uh, you know, black musical giants like Prince or James Brown were in the pop charts. Even all white bands like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Who, the Small Faces, they were all influenced by black American rhythm and blues, soul, and you know, even late and later on U2 as well, other bands like that. And they all paid homage to the black R&B artists and soul artists that inspired them. That's the generation I grew up in. And in the late 70s and early 80s, the two-tone music movement in Britain, which, you know, fused white British punk rock with late, with Jamaican ska and reggae, that two-tone music movement and record label saw multi-ethnic bands such as the Specials top the charts, and it was the norm for us growing up to see black, brown and white musicians and bands together. And for people who love football, there's many black footballers born and bred in England or even in Ireland who were viewed as belonging to the country as much as any white player, because they were culturally the same as us. They grew up and they had integrated with us. And that ethos that was prevalent in the 70s and 80s that emphasized black and white and brown kids uniting and loving music, fashion, football, was all very laudable. And I still concur with much of that ethos. Okay? However, it led to very many of the people who adopted that mindset, as I've talked about, to erroneously conflate criticism of any non-white, non-European culture with racism. And that in turn then led to the idea that to oppose unrestricted flows of people with darker skin from all of the world's non-white cultures is synonymous with white supremacy. I've got news for open borders progressives who are obsessed with skin colour and see everything through a racial lens. There's no BLM in Africa. It doesn't exist. Okay, I worked with a young Nigerian woman, but born and bred in Ireland, well integrated. Okay, and she told me that, you know, in Nigeria, no one cares that you're black. They don't care because everyone's black and they're not defined by it. It's a very Western way of looking at things, being defined by your skin colour. She said in Nigeria, people are just divided by their tribes. And more importantly, she emphasised religion. And we see that today in Nigeria with the Christians being murdered by other Nigerians who are Islamic supremacists. Okay, they're not uniting in a love of skin colour, are they? It's cultural, it's religious divides. And I mean, It must be very infuriating for decent, law-abiding Caribbeans, African Christians, Indians, people who came to these islands, many decades ago, and that are patriotic and well integrated. And now they're getting lumped in with, say, Islamic supremacists coming from Afghanistan, Somalia, or Nigeria, just because they're all non-whites. I mean, leftists are so obsessed with skin colour and viewing 21st century mass immigration through 70s and 80s racial politics that it blinds them to genuine cultural incompatibilities of certain immigrant groups, along with the security threats and the resource constraints that result from this 21st century open borders fiasco, an ongoing fiasco. And look, I've said it before in writing and in other videos that I've done, right, that it was only possible for culturally compatible West Indian, African immigrants who came here over the last few decades. It was only possible for them to become culturally British. Say Kemi Badenoch, who I have a lot of time for and I respect and admire and see her as British as myself. She could only become culturally British because there was a majority white British population and culture for her and other people like her to integrate with. If you make whole areas of cities non-native British, and especially if you make them Islamic, and that's not condemning all Muslims, but I don't need to qualify that all the time. I feel like I need to qualify that all the time, but I know it's not all of them. But if you make areas completely non-British, and if you make them especially Islamic, then there's no native culture for people to integrate with. Now, look, like I said, I'm not an ethnic nationalist. I'm of mixed Irish, Gael, Anglo-Scottish ancestry. I belong to these islands. I'm Irish, I'm British, this is where I belong. But you can only have civic nationalism if there's a dominant culture for people to integrate into. So it's going to finish up now because it's going on a bit, and I want to end this before 25 minutes if I can. But Boomer and Gen X progressives, they need to wake up to the fact that it's not the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s anymore. They need to have debates on mass immigration based in the 21st century on the conditions and terms of the 21st century. Because today's mass immigration isn't comparable to the limited migration of the 50s through to the 80s. And many of us, the peoples of these islands, including the many patriotic ethnic minority citizens, we agree with progressives that racism is wrong. Where we disagree with them is how they've extended that term and redefined it beyond its original meaning. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing racist about effective border controls. They have them in loads of majority black countries and brown-skinned countries. There's nothing racist about wanting manageable levels of immigration to consider resource constraints. And there's nothing racist about believing that the native peoples of the British Isles, that is the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish, the Northern Irish, and those of us who are a mix of all of those, that we should remain the majority, or that only cultures that are compatible with ours should be invited to live amongst us in manageable numbers so that they can integrate with us. I mean, this was all common sense only a few decades ago. I don't think it was even considered left-wing or right-wing. I've made a video about that. It was just common sense. Today, it's fascism. Baffling. Imagine going back in time to the 60s. I've often thought of this. Imagine you went back in time to the 60s, okay? And you informed the civil rights people in America that in 60 years' time, the people who proclaim themselves the loudest, that they're the most anti-racist people in society, that they will be the ones viewing every complicated issue through a racial lens and judging every individual based on the colour of their skin. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for today. If you liked this video, like it, please share it, please subscribe, and check me out on Substack if you're not over there. Okay, thanks. Thank you. Talk again.